fantastic brain. Now, I don't even hold that man comes from a monkey, even though some of us act like apes sometimes. I hold with the original idea that God knew what he was doing when he created man. Now, in various creations, like these earths, immediately after the fall, man was sent to the outer parts of the Garden of Eden, and he was forbidden to come back into the Garden of Eden. And from that time to the great deluge, the great flood, which could be considered creation number 3, up to that time, man had learned the unique experience of how much fun he was having killing off his neighbor. And at the same time, there are records dating back from the beginning, according to the universities and the Museum of Cairo, Egypt, dating back that they were seeing strange, unidentified objects in the skies. The ancient Chinese used to call them sky sparklers, sky fireworks. The ancient Egyptians called them flying boats, B-O-A-T-S. The ancient Romans called them fiery chariots, and the Greeks called them shields of fire. Up to the time of the flood, they were even having UFO sightings around this planet. The book tells us in those days, just prior to the flood, there were giants in the land. Not once do you read any reference to this particular race of giants after the great flood, simply because they succeeded in escaping the great flood by hiding on the inside of this planet. When the great flood came, as I mentioned during the seminar, the only reason they didn't believe him was because water up to that point in the history of the planet had never fallen from the sky. And the day of the great flood, the good book tells us, the fountains of the deep were loosed, the windows of the gods were open. And brother, did it rain. And all of a sudden people became converted. And they couldn't get into the ark because God gave him the direction how to construct this ark, gave him the full mathematical figures on how to put this big thing together, put one window, and that was at the top, facing the sky. It's the same God who gave the directions to the mother of that little baby Moses to build an ark. Gave her the proper dimensions, the mathematical configuration, so if it would roll over, it would erect itself. It would be waterproof, it would not harm the child. No weather condition could harm the child Moses. And yet people today will sit in our Christian churches and some other churches, and they'll have all kinds of visions of the Master Jesus, and we have such preconceived notions and preconceived ideas that Christ was killed on the tree of the cross by the enemy Romans putting huge spikes through his hands. I watched some Christian stations on television in the States, and they have deaf and dumb people who watch the program, and naturally they have someone who's making the signs. You've seen the deaf ministry? And to this day, for God, they go like this. And for Christ, you see? And for seeing, for hearing, and for heart. But they keep, every time they mention Christ, they go. Anybody can tell you who knows anything about it. If you hang a man of 185 pounds, as Christ, they believe, was, about 6 foot tall, from a cross on his, by driving a spike through the center, the palm of his hand, that the tissues and the bone structure of the hand would not be able to support his weight. That the nail would have shredded his hands and he would have flopped forward. And now the Shroud of Turin has opened the eyes of many, many theologians, and they're beginning to understand that the spikes were driven through the wrists of Christ and not the hands. How many of you have read that? Scientifically and medically it's been proven that a spike through the wrists would be able to support his weight on the cross. And yet, You can't get up and destroy people's theology. They're seeing visions of Christ with the nail prints in his hand. They've got songs. I shall know him by the nail prints in his hand. But you can't change all the songbooks and say, I'll know him by the nail prints in his wrist. It doesn't rhyme for one thing. And they want to, they've got preconceived ideas. You see? If you take the Bible in the original text, you find many things that will get you into trouble. Funny thing about Far Eastern religions and other types of religions, like the Hindu religion and the Mormon religion and many other religions, they have one thing in common, and this dates back thousands of years, before Christ. How many of you know that they came up with a golden rule long before Christ spoke those words? Do unto others as you would prefer they do unto you. That do you? No. Lord have mercy. But this golden rule is one of the chief planks on the platform of what I consider the Christian religion today. For me to do unto others as I would have them to do unto me. You see? And it's amazing how in the Scriptures we find these things can lead to good health, success, and prosperity. The same Spirit that moved on Moses, the same Spirit that caused the ancient Scriptures to be written, the same Spirit that caused all the wars and the commotion that allowed these things to take place. You take from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, clear through to the flood. And after the flood, armies were raised in the name of religion, and they slew other armies. You know, the Bible is one of the bloodiest books alive today. How many of you knew that? You see? And in that book, we find there are life-giving factors as well. We can't blame God on everything that's gone wrong with the human family. Man was born with a hard head. And some women, too. And we see traces of it down through human history. But you take in the days following the flood, how the earth was populated again, and how giants began to appear here and there. We find that the Almighty moved on a young fellow by the name of David when the Philistine army was threatening the armies of Israel. How many of you remember that in the Scriptures? And the Almighty said, now David, I want you to go down to the brook Kidron, and I want you to pick 5 smooth white stones. Well, one philosopher said, well, the reason the Almighty told him to choose 5 stones to go against this great big giant Goliath was because if he missed the first time, he'd have a few extra stones to take a second shot. I've got news for you. David would not have had a chance to take a second shot. So why 5 smooth white stones? Well, you examine your biblical history of the lineage of Goliath, and it tells us he had 4 brothers just as big and ornery, as cantankerous as he was. And just in case he decided to bring the whole family, God had little David